we doing today? Good. It's good to see all of you. Glad that you're here today. Well, we have a very special guest with us, and he's a very special guest for a few different reasons. So, have any of you ever heard of the word or the person that's called the superintendent of the school? Yeah. So, the superintendent is like the principal of all the schools in the district, and he has the same job that I do, and that's to keep you safe and to help you learn. And there's another very special reason that connects him to Cheyenne, as he used to be the principal of Cheyenne. He was Cheyenne's very first principal here when the building opened up, which is very exciting. So we are very happy to have him here today, and he's got a great story for you to listen to today to celebrate March's Reading Month. So can we give a big hand to Mr. Roberts?
So anyways, it is Reading Month. I love Reading Month. I was a teacher at one time, and I taught 2 different grade levels, not at the same time. When I first started teaching, I was a first grade teacher. And I loved teaching first grade. Kids were, well, first graders aren't they were about that tall. First graders are kind of small. I remember that most of my kids were about that tall. And then after I left first grade, I taught 5th grade, which you kids will be in next year, and I loved teaching 5th grade too. Both grades were good. And then I went on and did some other things and ended up in this job here. But one of my favorite things to do when I was a teacher was to read to kids. The books, you have to be careful about which book you choose, because some books are meant to be read silently and in your head. And they're wonderful, but they're more of silent books. And then there are books that when you read them, you say, oh my gosh, this is like a really good book to read out loud. And kids would like hearing that. So even when I was a 5th grade teacher, that was one of my favorite things to do with 5th graders, was to read to them, because I could find books that I thought were good read-alouds. And I think reading, when you read, you make wonderful pictures in your mind of what's going on. And I have never, ever, well, except for one, and I'll get to that, I've never found a movie that was made from a book where I like the movie better. I always like the book better. And I like the book better because there was so much more detail. And you create the pictures in your mind of what's going on. And I always thought, well, those are a lot better pictures than what they put on a movie screen. Except for one book that I kind of like the movie just as well. And that's from the author that I'm going to read today, which is Roald Dahl. And it was Charlie and the Chocolate Factory. And the movie was called Willy Wonka. I found that one to be almost, or maybe equally as good as the book. That's because I think that they put all the things in the movie that you thought about when you were reading the book, and how things looked as the person who made the movie, how he made them look, was really very exciting, and I really love that. But most of the time that doesn't happen. So Roald Dahl, who I'll read from you today, he's from the country of Wales. And Wales is part of the United Kingdom, which is across the ocean. There's an island, and it's got England on it, and it's got Scotland on it, and it's got Wales on it. And it's like 3 little countries, but they're all under the same government. And his name is a little bit different because his parents had come from Norway. So his name is more Norwegian. But he lived in the country of Wales. Now, he wrote so many books that kids read and still read today, and he's not living anymore. And he has been living for quite a few years. But kids still read his books because they're that good. But do you know, you probably don't know, and I was surprised to learn this, that when he was a student in school, you would think someone who becomes a famous author would just be like this wonderful student who did things so well and could really write. And if you were sitting next to him in class when you were in school and you looked at his paper on what he was writing, you'd probably say, wow, that kid can really write. That wasn't the case with him. He was not really a particularly good student. He was a smart kid, but he really didn't like school. And he really didn't care about doing anything. He did just enough to get by. So, when he graduated from high school, he didn't go for more education. Instead, he joined a company went to work for a company called Shell Oil Company. And sometimes if you drive around with your parents, they do have gas stations still in this area. You ever notice it's the big yellow Shell? That's Shell Oil. And that's who he worked for. And he wanted to see the world. So he traveled with Shell Oil Company to the continent of Africa, and he lived in Africa. And that's what he wanted to do. And obviously, you know, Shell saw that he was a smart person and that he would be a good employee. So they were happy to have him with the company. Well, then World War II came along. So, in World War II happened mostly in Europe, and it even happened a little bit in North Africa, where he was. But when World War II came along, he joined what England called the Royal Air Force. So he was in the Air Force for England. And, you know, European countries were involved in the war, and he enlisted and became a pilot for the Royal Air Force. Now, to be a pilot, you have to have a lot of good skills, because they're going to put you in a plane, and you're going to fly the plane, and you do very dangerous things. And they made him a pilot. Well, he was flying in North Africa on a mission during World War II, and his plane was shot down. And fortunately, he was able to land the plane in a way that he wasn't harmed. Okay, he spent some time in the hospital, but he lived, of course, because then he became a writer later on. So what happened after that kind of led to his writing career, because he stayed with the Royal Air Force, but he became a writer for the Royal Air Force. He couldn't fly planes anymore, so he became a writer for the Royal Air Force. And that's how he first started to write. Well, he wasn't writing children's books at the times. He was writing government-type official documents. He wasn't doing like fun stuff. It was documents. And so he got married, he had children, and he used to tell them stories. And he had a wild imagination. And that's how he started on his path to becoming a children's book writer, was by telling stories, bedtime stories, to his kids. And he always said, if you're not telling your kids a good story, they let you know. So he knew that his stories had to be good. And so in his mind, he made up great stories. He even wrote screenplays for movies. Some James Bond movies he wrote screenplays for. So he really was well-versed and could do a lot of things. And this is how he would write. In the backyard of his house, he had what you kids, if you don't have, you would love to have. And that's your own private shed, or his little clubhouse. And that's where he would write every day. It was like his writing shed. And he would go out there every single day, and he would write for 4 hours every single day. He would write in the morning before lunch, and he would write after lunch for 2 more hours, 2 and 2, every single day. And that was his personal space, and he was the only one in it. And in his shed was a big, comfortable chair. And then, you know, a pool table has felt over it. He took a board and he wrapped it with that green felt. And he would put it in his lap and he would write. And before he went to his shed, he would sharpen pencils every single day. And he would always use the same kind of pencils. He would use Dixon Ticonderoga pencils. Now, here is a box of Dixon Ticonderoga pencils. They still make them today. And that's the kind of pencils he liked. And he liked pencils with good erasers on them, because he was writing with a pencil, and sometimes he would cross words out, and sometimes he would take his eraser and erase. And when he did, you know, when you're erasing with a pencil and that little dust gets everywhere, you know, little dust from an eraser, he would just brush it off his little writing board and knock it on the floor. And he had a rule about his writing shed. He never cleaned it. He never would clean it. That was his special place, just like you would like to have that in your house, something that you could just hang out in and never clean. You know how it is. Your parents always want you to clean your space. Well, he said, this is my space, and I'm going to do what I want. My wife wants the house clean. This is my shed, and I don't care what it's like. So it was a dirty, dusty place. He welcomed spiders. If there was a spider web up there, that was okay. I mean, if the spider web started coming down onto him, he might say, okay, I can't really work in these kind of conditions. But if they were up there, that was okay. And that was his special place. And I really think when I learned about his special place, I just think that helped him to be such a better writer. That was his place, his atmosphere. So I'm going to read from one of the books that he wrote in his writing shed in the country of England, because that's where he ended up living, in England. And it's called George's Marvelous Medicine. Now, let me give you a little bit of introduction to the book. George is a small boy. He's young. He could be close to your age. And he lives on a farm in a countryside. And there's not a lot of kids to play with. And he's there with his parents and his grandmother. Wait till you meet his grandmother. His first chapter is called Grandma. I'm going shopping in the village, George's mother said to George on a Saturday morning. So be a good boy and don't get into any mischief. This was a silly thing to say to a small boy at any time. It immediately made him wonder what sort of mischief he might get into. And don't forget to give Grandma her medicine at 11 o'clock, his mother said. Then out she went, closing the back door behind her. Grandma, who was dozing in her chair by the window, opened one wicked little eye and said, Now, you heard what your mother said, George. Don't forget my medicine. Well, no, Grandma, George said. And just try to behave yourself for once while she's away. Yes, Grandma, George said. George was bored to tears. He didn't have a brother or a sister. His father was a farmer, and the farm they lived on was miles away from anywhere, so there were never any children to play with. He was tired of staring at pigs and hens and cows and sheep. He was especially tired of having to live in that same house as that grisly old grunion of a grandma. Looking after her all by himself was hardly the most exciting way to spend a Saturday morning. I know what you're thinking right now. You're thinking, whew, I'm so glad my grandmother isn't like that. You can make me a nice cup of tea for a start, Grandma said to George. That'll keep you out of mischief for a few minutes. Yes, Grandma, George said. George couldn't help disliking Grandma. She was a selfish, grumpy old woman. She had pale brown teeth and a small, puckered-up mouth. How much sugar in your tea today, Grandma? George asked her. 1 spoonful, she said, and no milk. Most grandmothers are lovely, kind, helpful old ladies, but not this one. She spent all day and every day sitting in her chair by the window, and she was always complaining, grousing, grouching, grumbling, griping about something or other. Never once, even on her best days, had she smiled at George and said, Well, how are you this morning, George? Or, why don't you and I have a game of snakes and ladders? Or, how was school today? She didn't seem to care about other people, only about herself. She was a miserable old grouch. George went into the kitchen and made Grandma a cup of tea with a tea bag. He put 1 spoon of sugar in it and no milk. He stirred the sugar well and carried the cup into the living room. Grandma sipped the tea. It's not sweet enough, she said. Put more sugar in! George took the cup back to the kitchen and added another spoonful of sugar. He stirred it again and carried it carefully into Grandma. Where's the saucer? She said. I won't have a cup without a saucer. George fetched her a saucer. And what about a teaspoon, if you please? Oh, I've stirred it for you, Grandma. I stirred it well. I'll stir my own tea. Thank you very much. Fetch me a teaspoon. George fetched her a teaspoon. When George's mother or father was home, grandmother never ordered George about like this. It was only when she had him on her own and she began to treat him badly. You know what's the matter with you? The old woman said, staring at George over the rim of the teacup with those bright, wicked little eyes. You're growing too fast. Boys who grow too fast become stupid and lazy. But I can't help it if I'm growing fast, Grandma. George said, Of course you can, she snapped. Growing's a nasty, childish habit. But we have to grow, Grandma. If we didn't grow, we would never be grown-ups. Rubbish, boy, rubbish, she said. Look at me. Am I growing? Certainly not. But you did once, Grandma. Only very little, the old woman answered. I gave up growing when I was extremely small, along with the other nasty childish habits like laziness and disobedience and greed and sloppiness and untidiness and stupidity. You haven't given up any of these things, have you? Well, I'm still only a little boy, Grandma. You're 8 years old. That's old enough to know better. If you don't stop growing now, soon, it will be too late. Too late for what, Grandma? It's ridiculous, she went on. You're nearly as tall as me already. George took a good look at Grandma. She certainly was a very tiny person. Her legs were so short she had to have a footstool to put her feet on, and her head only came halfway up the back of the armchair. Well, Daddy says it's fine for a man to be tall, George said. Don't listen to your daddy. Listen to me. But how do I stop myself from growing? George asked her. Eat less chocolate, Grandma said. Does chocolate make you grow? It makes you grow the wrong way, she snapped. Up instead of down. Grandma sipped some tea but never took her eyes from the little boy who stood before her. Never grow up. Always down. Yes, Grandma. And stop eating chocolate. Eat cabbage instead. Oh, cabbage. Oh no. I don't like cabbage, George said. It's not what you like or what you don't like, Grandma snapped. It's what's good for you that counts. From now on, you must eat cabbage 3 times a day. Mountains of cabbage. And if it's got caterpillars in it, so much the better. Ooh, no, Grandma, George said. Caterpillars give you brains. Well, Mummy washes them down the sink, George said. Mummy is wrong, Grandma said. Cabbage doesn't taste of anything without a few boiled caterpillars in it. Slugs, too. Not slugs, George cried out. I couldn't eat slugs. Whenever I see a live slug on a piece of lettuce, Grandma said, I gobble it up quick before it crawls away. It's delicious. She squeezed her lips together tight to make her mouth seem like a tiny wrinkled hole. Delicious, she said again. Worms and slugs and beetly bugs. You don't know what's good for you. You're joking, Grandma. I never joke, Grandma said. Beetles are perhaps the best of all because they go crunch. Grandma, that's awful. The old hag grinned, showing those pale brown teeth. Sometimes, if you're lucky, she said, you get a beetle inside the stem of a stick of celery. That's what I like. Grandma, how could you? You find all sorts of nice things in sticks of raw celery, the old woman went on. Sometimes it's earwigs. Oh. Kids, I agree. I don't want to hear about it, George cried. A big, fat earwig is very tasty, Grandma said, licking her lips. But if you've got to be very quick, my dear, when you put one of those in your mouth, it has a pair of sharp nippers on its back end. And if it grabs your tongues with those, it never lets go. So you've got to bite the earwig first, chop, chop, before it bites you. George started edging towards the door. He wanted to get as far away as possible from this mean old woman. You're trying to get away from me, aren't you? She said, pointing a finger straight at George's face. You're trying to get away from your grandma. Little George stood by the door, staring at the old hag in the chair. She stared back at him. Could it be, George wondered, that she was a witch? He had always thought witches were only in fairy tales, but now he was not so sure. Come closer to me, little boy, she said, beckoning to him with her long finger. Come closer to me, and I will tell you secrets. George didn't move. Grandma didn't move either. I know a great many secrets, she said, and suddenly she smiled. It was a thin, icy smile, the kind a snake might make just before it bites you. Come over here to Grandma, and she'll whisper secrets to you. George took a step backward, edging closer to the door. You mustn't be frightened of your old grandma, she said, smiling that icy smile. George took another step backward. Some of us, she said, and all at once she was leaning forward in her chair and whispering in a throaty sort of voice George had never heard her use before. Some of us have magic powers that can twist the creatures of this earth into wondrous shapes. A tingle of electricity flashed down the length of George's spine. He began to feel frightened. Some of us, the old woman went on, have fire on our tongues and sparks in our bellies and wizardry in the tips of our fingers. Some of us know secrets that would make your hair stand straight up on end and your eyes pop out of their sockets. George wanted to run away, but his feet seemed stuck to the floor. We know how to make your nails drop off and teeth grow out of your fingers instead. George began to tremble. It was her face that frightened him most of all. The frosty smile, the brilliant, unblinking eyes. We know how to have you wake up in the morning with a long tail coming out from behind you. Grandma, Grandma, George cried. Stop, please stop. We know secrets, my dear, about dark places where dark things live and squirm and slither all over each other. George made a dive for the door. It doesn't matter how far you run, he heard her say. You won't ever get away. George ran into the kitchen, slamming the door behind him. Wow. Can you imagine having a grandma like that? And to think, just be happy you don't. George, oh, he's got a little bit of a problem here. He lives out on a farm. There aren't other people around. His parents are there. You learned, you heard. She treats him okay. So, the second chapter is called The Marvelous Plan. Because George has to have a plan to deal with this. This book may be available in your library. And if it's not, you can still go to Barnes & Noble and buy it. Or if you're the type of person who likes to do online shopping, you could do it that way too. But I always say, let's support our brick and mortar stores. And maybe go to Barnes & Noble. You might even find some other books as you look around that you like to read. Now, maybe you get an allowance because you actually clean your room or do something like that, so maybe you could spend your allowance money on it. Or maybe you have a birthday coming up. Or sometimes kids get little gifts, and Easter is coming up. You could ask for George's Marvelous Medicine, because I'm not sure that there's going to be enough available in your library. But it's worth a read, because George he has a problem, and he has to figure out a way to solve it. Now, you kids have been so good. I think it has something to do with your teachers. Oh, you're good too on your own, I know. What I'm going to leave for you today, because I want you to channel the writing ability of Roald Dahl, is with the teachers. I'll leave a Dixon Ticonderoga pencil for each of you. Thank you. I encourage you to read Roald Dahl books. You know that there's a lot of movies out there too that are a lot of fun to watch, like Matilda is one. And maybe some of you saw the new movie that came out that tells the story of Willy Wonka before. He didn't write that, but it's about his work. So there you go. Thank you.